ของเก็บเงินเก็บบอลวันนี้นะคะหากใครที่ติดตามประเด็นของ Brexit อยู่แล้วและอยากจะรู้ว่าปีหน้านั้น Brexit จะส่งผลอย่างไรบ้างกับภาพของตลาดตราสารหนี้ด้วยพลาดไม่ได้กับหัวข้อ Brexit and what does it mean for the bond market นะคะซึ่งได้รับเกียรติจากทางคุณมุสตาคาปาซีนะคะ Chief Representative Officer Asia Pacific ที่จะมาร่วมพูดคุยกับเราซึ่งวันนี้ทางรายการได้รับเกียรติจากทางคุณภักพล พุทธิธาดามาเป็นผู้ดำเนินรายการด้วยในช่วงนี้ไปติดตามรายละเอียดกันได้เลยค่ะ
สนับสนุนโดยสมาคมตลาดตราสารหนี้ไทย
Thank you, Kun Grata. Welcoming our honorable guest from the International Capital Market Association, or ICMA. A warm welcome to Mr. Mushtaq Kapasi, Chief Representative, Asia Pacific, once again to the show.
Thank you very much.
Could you please give us a brief introduction of your background?
Sure. The ICMA is the International Capital Market Association. We are a nonprofit association of participants in the capital markets globally. So we have about 500 members located in 60 countries around the world. And what we do is we promote better standards and better practices for the capital market industry, in particular the debt capital markets. So bond markets, primary debt markets, repo, and other related markets as well. So we do standard documentation, we do market practices and procedures, and we work with a number of committees and our members to help the markets grow and become more efficient. We also speak quite frequently to regulators to look at the way that regulations are going and to advise on policy to help make the markets better for the global financial system.
To start with, could you please explain briefly to our audience what Brexit is?
Brexit, okay. No, that's a good question. Thank you for asking that at the beginning. I know people talk about Brexit a lot, Brexit this, Brexit that. So what exactly is Brexit? Brexit is the United Kingdom, so not just Britain, but the United Kingdom in particular, leaving the European Union. So right now, the European Union is a political union of 28 European countries that come together and make laws for all of them, so all of the countries together. And under the EU, if you are a member of the EU and the European Union, the Parliament passes a law and it gets put into law as European law, then every country that is a member of the EU is obligated to follow that law, either to make it a law of their own or to implement it through their regulations. So the UK has been a member of the EU, and the UK has now, through a referendum, the people who are able to vote in the UK have chosen through a vote to leave the EU. And so Brexit is a funny way of saying Britain exit. So it's Brexit.
Would you be able to predict what would happen in the coming 2 years affecting Asia Pacific?
Well, I wish I could. If I could, I would probably change jobs and become a trader because that would be a lot better. But unfortunately, we really cannot predict right now what the effect of Brexit is going to be, in particular on the global markets, much less the Asian markets. But we do have a sense of the roadmap ahead, even though the timeline is uncertain and even though the particular implications are uncertain. We also know that in the short term, there will be uncertainty. There are a lot of unanswered questions. There is going to be some market volatility and some difficulty in understanding exactly where the laws are going to go. So maybe I can step back and give a bit of a sense of how Brexit is going to play out in practice. So again, Brexit means the UK leaving the European Union and becoming a non-member, becoming its own country, so to speak. So the first thing that has to happen is that under the EU treaty, the UK has to give notice under EU law that it wants to leave the European Union. This is what you may have heard, it's called Article 50. So the UK first has to do that before anything happens. Even though there's been this referendum, this vote, that actually doesn't mean that the UK is automatically left the EU. So first they give the notice. Then after they give the notice, then the EU and the UK have 2 years under EU law to negotiate the terms of withdrawal. What I mean by terms of withdrawal, it's a contract. What is the relationship going to be between the UK and the EU once the EU has left? How exactly is the UK going to leave the EU? Some of these are a little bit tricky because the UK, for example, contributes to the EU budget. There are some operational aspects. What about EU offices located in the UK? How are all these things going to happen, right? So the EU and the UK have to negotiate all of these things after the notice has been given, and under EU law, there's 2 years for that. So it could get complete right away, but it might not even get done in 2 years. If it doesn't get done in 2 years, then automatically the UK falls away from the EU, and the relationship is just like that of any country with another country without any contracts in place. So that's the general steps that need to occur. Until that occurs, there's going to be a lot of uncertainty about the capital markets, about whether EU firms can operate in the UK, whether UK firms can operate within the EU, and whether capital markets rules that are EU rules are actually going to apply in the UK long term. For now, I should make the point very clearly that the laws have actually not changed. The UK is still a member of the EU right now, and the UK still is governed, or the UK markets are still governed by the EU capital markets rules. And the single market of the EU with respect to capital market products, bonds, stocks, etc., that's still there. So actually, in terms of the legal position and the real market infrastructure, nothing has changed. But now that you have the vote to leave the EU, and now that you have the negotiations that have started, there's a lot of uncertainty about what will happen to Europe and the UK.
Let's kick off with the first question.
Sure.
On the implications of Brexit. What would be your viewpoints on the Brexit against overall financial system and economy?
So I take I'd say a middle view here. So I think that some people were thinking that when Brexit happened, it might be catastrophic for the industry. It might be a Lehman type event or something really huge to cause a financial crisis. But I think that's not the case. I think that at least the vote itself has come and gone, and while it has been negative for the value of the UK pound, that's for sure. It has not caused any major global financial upheaval that happened in the global financial crisis a few years ago. So I would say that while it has not been hugely disruptive to the markets, it is affecting the markets. And what I think market participants are uncertain about is how strong the EU will be, how strong the UK will be, how well the two markets are going to be able to work together and support each other, and actually what the legal framework will be for the relationships between the UK and the EU and the regional capital markets. And until that is resolved, there is going to be a lot of uncertainty that may not be resolved for 1 or 2 years at least, if not longer. And also another angle to this is that the financial institutions themselves that are operating in the UK and EU are very uncertain about where their operations are going to be, how much they're going to be able to offer their services in the EU and the UK. So from a strategic point of view for the financial institutions, it's a kind of a difficult decision as well. So I think in the short term, I think we will see some further volatility in the markets. We will see some changes of behavior based on a wait-and-see attitude to what the laws will be in the future, in the near term. But I don't see any major upheaval, at least right now. Although we've all been surprised by some of the things that have happened in the Brexit negotiations and even the court decision last week. Yeah, so you never know what's going to happen. It's very hard to predict, unfortunately.
On to question 2, on the impacts of Brexit on the financial and bond markets.
Sure.
What would be your opinion on short and long-term impacts of Brexit on global financial markets and economy?
So on the economy, it's I think the impact is probably not going to be positive in the short term. Although again, it's impossible to predict. Basically, with the UK coming out of the EU, then that is going to affect existing trade agreements.
Yeah.
That's going to affect the existing trade bloc, and it will potentially create more fragmentation in goods and services trade. So that is most likely going to be either neutral or negative for the economy. In the long term, it really depends on how the negotiations come out. So there are a few options for what the UK can do. It looks very likely that the UK will leave the European Union. So I think that is a fait accompli. But will the single market for goods and services, single market for financial services still exist? Will there still be some sort of capital markets union? These questions are uncertain, and we won't know at least for a couple of years. If there is still some sort of a single market or a very close equivalence between the UK and the EU, then I think some of the negative aspects of Brexit will be mitigated. But if it is more of a hard break where you have two very separate markets, then I think that could further fragment bond markets. And of course, as we see in Asia, where the bond markets are very fragmented, that can prevent the flow of capital. It can prevent liquidity from increasing, and it can harm things like infrastructure investment in the region.
Right. Well, referring to uncertainties in the market you mentioned, would you foresee any funds flow into emerging markets, including Thailand?
Good question. It's difficult for me to say. I think as a direct result of Brexit, the answer would be probably no. So the fact that the voters of the UK are deciding to leave the EU, I don't think you're going to find any asset managers deciding to go to Thailand instead of somewhere else. Now, having said that, the indirect effects are going to play out over time, and I think there could be an opportunity there. So, in general, if Brexit causes the position of the of the UK bond market to decrease, if it causes the overall position of the EU bond market to decrease, then that could lift up Asia as a global bond market, which could then have implications for Thailand as well. But I think it's fair to say that if the European markets are getting more fragmented, then that will create opportunities for emerging markets globally, including Thailand. So it's really a function not only of what is happening between the UK and the EU, but also the regulatory reform and the ongoing cooperation between, say, ASEAN nations and different Asian nations. So all this is going to play out. And I think that what we're seeing in general is a general consolidation of Asian markets, along with the fragmentation of European markets, which could create some opportunities.
Right. All right. Well, that might link us to effects of the existing financial transactions.
Sure.
How would Brexit affect existing financial transactions? For example, debt issuance transaction costs and or bond trading transaction costs.
Right. Well, that's a good question. Again, I hate to be a broken record, but I think it's uncertain at this point, pending the outcome of the negotiations, which nobody knows. And we wish, at ICMA, we wish we knew the answers too, because then everyone would be happier and they could plan for the future. But right now, the unfortunate thing is that we do not. The fortunate thing, though, is that, at least as far as I can tell, for new primary debt issuances, Brexit itself, at least so far, the vote, has not caused a huge increase in issuance costs because it hasn't changed the actual legal regime, and it hasn't changed the rules for offering securities in different markets. Now, over the next 1 to 2 years, there could be fragmentation of the bond markets. So, for example, you may have banks in the UK that are not able to offer market bonds in the rest of the EU. You may have asset managers in the EU that may not be able to offer their services in the UK, for example. You may have licensing difficulties that make it not as easy for capital to go across borders from the EU to the UK. If that is the case, then there may be an increase in costs due to the reduced liquidity, the reduced obligations to comply with 2 sets of regulations and the additional operational costs.
Well, to a final question on lesson learned
Sure.
from the Brexit's impact and the road ahead, would you include the significant economic repercussions to the global economy inclusive of the related financial aspects and currency appreciation and depreciation?
Sure. So I think the overall repercussions of Brexit, it is a significant occurrence. I think the European Union has created a single market that has been quite successful and quite robust. The structure of the global markets is going to change. London is hugely important as a trading center, and if it is separated from the rest of Europe, that is going to cause a lot of uncertainty and dislocation. It's also creating some volatility in the currency markets, as we're seeing with the sterling, right? So clearly the markets, at least, are saying that the sterling is weaker and that the potential emerging markets are now stronger. But that could reverse itself as well. We never know what can happen, and things are happening week by week here that we're really not sure how the regulations are going to pan out. So I think that there have been repercussions. One thing that I would say is that from ICMA's point of view, fragmentation of markets is a negative thing, right? Because what we promote is liquidity in bond markets. We promote the cross-border flow of capital. And ultimately, what are you trying to do? You're trying to fund the needs of businesses, of projects, of governments, and you're trying to find the capital to meet the demand. And quite often, the supply is in one jurisdiction, the demand is in the other jurisdiction, and it's through the international capital markets that you can bridge that gap. To the extent that the markets are fragmented, it makes it more difficult to encourage cross-border flows, and that, in our view, is negative for the economy. So we would encourage a positive resolution of the negotiations between the UK and the EU. And of course, we would encourage further consolidation and cooperation among the Asian markets so that we can have a better and more efficient international capital market in Asia.
We've already witnessed volatilities on currencies. What about other foreseeable impacts? Would you consider? Just briefly.
I think there certainly will be unforeseeable impacts. I can foresee the unforeseeable impacts, absolutely, but I don't know what they will be. I think that things are there are so many moving pieces right now. It's not only the people of the United Kingdom who have voted to exit the UK, but also now within UK politics, within European EU politics. Global politics, of course, will affect this. Monetary policy, monetary conditions, the financial markets. So even if something happens in the EU with respect to its banking system, if there's some sort of crisis that has nothing to do with the UK, that could affect the stance of the EU with respect to Brexit. So I think that the world is very interconnected now, and it's just extremely hard to predict. The only thing I can predict is that there probably will be more unpredictable things happening in the markets over the next couple of years.
So, well, it's been such a great honor to have you as our honorable guest. Thank you for your time and kind consideration and sharing your thoughts.
Thank you. It's really been a pleasure. Appreciate it.
Thank you.